Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a truly fascinating framework called diakrisis. Today, we're exploring the architecture of responsible complexity. We're going to unpack a really interesting core hypothesis, that modern complex systems don't usually fail because they're full of contradictions. No, they actually fail because they simply forget what an idea actually is. They completely lose track of what kind of thing a given artifact has become within their own walls.
So, think about this for a second. When does a metaphor become a mandate? You've probably seen this happen. It's that strange moment in any complex organization where a simple formulation, maybe just a casual descriptive sentence, suddenly crosses an unmarked threshold. All of a sudden, it becomes so much heavier than the person who originally wrote it. It gets repeated, formatted, and suddenly treated with this dangerous level of respect usually reserved for hard rules. Nobody actually authorized it, but everyone is suddenly too afraid to question it.
You can actually trace the disastrous life cycle of an unmarked idea. It usually starts out at step 1, as a totally harmless poetic metaphor. But then it drifts into step 2 and becomes a speculative model. And finally, before anyone even realizes what's happened, it quietly enlists itself as step 3, an operational protocol. A harmless hypothesis becomes a working assumption, that assumption turns into a rigid rule, and then that rule starts looking for a desk to operate from. The problem isn't necessarily the transformation itself. The real issue is that everyone forgets to mark the crossing. Which brings us to defining our central framework. What is diakrisis? Basically, it's an architecture of distinction under uncertainty. It steps in right before a decision is made, before all that complexity collapses into premature validity. Now, it's absolutely crucial to understand that diakrisis is neither a censor nor a liberator. It doesn't judge the content or produce some kind of doctrine. Instead, think of it like a membrane. It structures the exact conditions for an artifact to responsibly enter a system, and it slows the passage from possibility to validity just long enough for the system to actually read its own movement.
And that introduces us to a concept called layer intelligence, which is really the first major capacity of diakrisis. Because treating a fictional device as a conceptual model, or taking a basic analysis and treating it as a firm recommendation, isn't just a simple category error. It is literally a structural survival threat. A system that can't notice its own layer transitions is eventually going to make terrible decisions, even if it has world-class data, simply because it's operating on a fundamental misunderstanding of what it's looking at.
Let's think about common operational layers. You've got analysis, narration, speculation, the manifesto, simulation, protocol, and the risk annex. These are not just academic labels. Each layer permits entirely different movements and carries very different risks. If a piece of work mixes these layers up without explicitly marking them, you're going to run into trouble. Take a manifesto, for example. It's supposed to speak with heat and passion, but if that passionate heat leaks into a technical protocol layer without cooling down and being properly marked, it easily becomes a remarkably eloquent machine for total confusion.
There is this fantastic, witty line from the text that I just love. A thought that never becomes structure is merely elegant weather. And it's so true. Crossing thresholds is completely necessary if a system wants to be more than just decorative. Systems have to cross thresholds or they just stagnate. The actual danger lies entirely in the unmarked crossing. Unmarked crossings are the quiet origin of escalation.
Think about how a bad system operates versus a diakrisis system. A bad system literally worships speed. It acts like a rocket crashing into a wall, equating how fast it can detect and optimize things with actual intelligence. But diakrisis purposely introduces delay. And this delay is not some annoying administrative red tape. It acts as an epistemic organ. It carves out a vital space between formulation and validity, which is exactly what prevents a really fast mistake from becoming the new normal. It refuses to let the mere fact that something can be said become a sufficient reason for letting it operate.
Section 1. Guardians without judgment. Friction without sovereignty.
The distinction we're making here is absolute. Think of a judge. A judge decides an artifact's ultimate worth. They approve or they condemn. A guardian, on the other hand, does not judge. It simply marks. It exposes vulnerabilities, things like semantic drift, irreversibility, or dominance patterns, all within an existing normative horizon. For instance, an ethics guardian can't just define ethics out of thin air, but it can enthusiastically wave a flag when it notices an artifact risks instrumentalizing a person or drifting way outside its original layer. There's a great bit of dry irony in the text here. A guardian that blocks everything is only fear with an office. Doesn't that perfectly capture it?
Diakrisis is absolutely not about censoring or suppressing thought. A reckless system looks at all risk and calls it vitality, while a really poor system just reaches for the delete button. Diakrisis just asks for precision. It wants to keep dangerous ideas thinkable, but strictly in the exact right place.
Moving on to Section 2, Shadow as a Resource, Managing Unintegrated Ideas.
So what is shadow? It's basically the compost heap of unintegrated ideas, minority reports, rejected hypotheses, and all those unresolved contradictions. Most systems either repress the stuff out of pure anxiety, or they mistakenly enthrone it because they confuse unresolved force for profound truth. Now, deleting this difficult material might look nice and clean in the short term, but it is incredibly expensive epistemically. It causes institutional amnesia. Diakrisis relies on sanitization instead, but not in a hygienic, scrub-it-clean sense. It means transforming placement. It restructures where an artifact lives, separates out the risky aspects, and preserves the critical space between total suppression and foolish dissemination. Take a look at this risk lattice. It shows us how diakrisis completely avoids that primitive intellectual binary of everything just being either active or forbidden. Risk should always determine form before it determines erasure. So low risk means integrate, medium means contextualize. But when we hit high or critical risk, we don't just hit delete. We map those specific risks to nuanced structural dispositions, using things like an annex, latency, or an archive. Let's dig a little deeper into those high-risk options. An annex isn't just a dark cellar to throw away bad ideas. It's a marked, controlled secondary chamber for material that technically belongs to the work, but carries way too much risk for the main line of argument. Then you have latency, which safely holds an unstable hypothesis until the system is actually ready for it. And finally, the archive. This is an append-only trace that preserves accountability. It actively prevents a system from developing the false innocence of claiming it never made a mistake or never even considered a dangerous path.
Section 3, Evolution Without Amnesia, The Append-Only History.
You know, a system that protects itself too well actually achieves perfect safety by becoming completely uninteresting. It becomes like a tax form. Diakrisis actually wants to enable evolution by allowing new modules and voices to emerge, but it does so under very specific conditions. Because transformation does not require amnesia, diakrisis enforces an append-only history. When new things are added, we always have to be able to reconstruct what changed, why it changed, and, importantly, what can be rolled back. Silent overwriting is basically a crime in unstable systems because it lets them claim continuity while secretly changing their actual identity. Diakrisis stops evolution from becoming just an ornamental mess.
Section 4, Responsibility Without Delegation. Who makes the decision?
Now, this brings us to probably the most tempting misuse of this whole framework. The moment humans or institutions try to hide behind diakrisis to avoid making difficult choices themselves. This line has to be guarded brutally. Think about moral laundering. If someone stands up and says, diakrisis has decided, the architecture has fundamentally failed. Diakrisis cannot generate values, and it can't act as your epistemic judge. The only correct stance is an ethics of visibility, not substitution. It should be, diakrisis has made visible the conditions under which this decision would stand. At the end of the day, responsibility always remains with the one who acts. A system that can't imagine its own corruption is already rehearsing it. Like anything, this can go wrong, and the failure modes are pretty revealing. It can overregulate and completely lock up, or it can underregulate and let wild speculation leak like oil right into operations. You've got bureaucratization, which is really just overregulation, but with endless stacks of paper and a nicer tie. And if the system's language suffers from aesthetic capture, meaning it becomes a pompous costume for giving interviews, or if authority projection turns our guardians into judges, the framework has completely betrayed its own purpose. Because systems often confuse being visible with being important, they have a bad habit of building minor empires of mandatory attention. Diakrisis fights this by being strictly event-driven. It's absolutely vital that diakrisis sleeps during periods of low complexity. It scales with the risk profile, not the drama. Its highest maturity isn't total control. Its highest maturity is actually the ability to disappear, to remain latent without ever leaving the system defenseless. And this extends to its form, too. Form isn't just decoration. A rhetorically overheated architecture practically begs for authority projection. When a manifesto borrows the serious tone of science, it gains illegitimate weight. So the system relies on a certain dry irony to puncture any false solemnity. keeping the architecture from mistaking its own vocabulary for destiny.
Section 5. A Poetics of Responsibility. Aesthetic Stabilization.
Ultimately, complexity doesn't need a sovereign ruler. It doesn't need some theological eye judging everything from above. What Diakrisis offers is an ethics of visibility rather than substitution. It exists to ensure that before any decision is made, a distinction is clearly marked, and that difference, risk, and memory remain completely readable to everyone involved. I want to leave you with one final provocative question to think about. What responsibility appears at the exact moment of formulation? I really encourage you to consider this the next time you introduce a bold new idea, a metaphor, or a speculative model into a complex system. Challenge yourself to recognize the true weight of your own artifacts and make sure to mark their layers clearly long before they harden into reality. Thanks for joining me for today's explainer, and remember to keep questioning your thresholds.